Welcome back to Kleppers Corner, Today in History. If you've ever wondered whether history unfolds gradually through thoughtful planning, careful diplomacy, and rational decision-making, then congratulations. You have clearly never looked at the events of March 12th. Because across centuries, this date has hosted collapsing empires, ideological revolutions, disastrous public health decisions, the birth of mass consumer culture, and even the discovery of new planets. That's right. March 12th is basically history's version of a group chat, where every century shows up yelling, "Guys, you won't believe what just happened." So tonight, we take a journey through time to see what happens when one date manages to host centuries of chaos, ambition, genius, and the occasional catastrophic mistake. Segment 1, the day Rome realized the Middle Ages were not a phase. March 12th in the year 538 marks the moment the Ostrogothic king Vitiges finally abandoned his siege of Rome and retreated, leaving the Byzantine general Belisarius in control of the city, which sounds like a victory for the Roman world, until you realize this war basically finished off what was left of classical Rome. The Goths had cut the aqueducts feeding the city, which meant no running water, no public baths, and suddenly Rome, the city famous for its infrastructure, became a place where bathing became optional. Nothing says the fall of civilization quite like a city that invented plumbing suddenly going, you know what, the river will do. Belisarius did manage to save the city with some clever improvisation, including building floating water mills on the Tiber, which is impressive until you realize the real historical takeaway here is that Rome went from 1 million residents during the empire to basically the population of a large medieval farmer's market. But if Rome collapsing into medieval obscurity wasn't enough chaos for one date, March 12th had another trick up its sleeve. Because in 1088, a man named Odo of Chatillon was elected Pope Urban II. Now, normally the election of a pope is a religious administrative matter, but Urban II had bigger plans, because 7 years later he would stand at the Council of Clermont and launch the First Crusade, which means March 12th quietly helped set in motion 2 centuries of holy war across the Mediterranean. That's right. One day Rome loses its aqueducts, and 5 centuries later, the papacy launches a continent-spanning military pilgrimage, which suggests history has always operated under the same rule as social media. One dramatic post leads to an entire thread of escalating chaos. Segment 2, colonies, kings, and the landscaping of absolute power. Fast forward to 1537, and we land in Portuguese Brazil, where the crown formally establishes the colonial settlement of Recife. Now, Recife would become a major sugar-producing center, which sounds sweet until you remember the sugar economy depended heavily on the brutal transatlantic slave trade. European empires loved sugar plantations because they produced enormous wealth. They were less enthusiastic about discussing the human cost that made those profits possible. And history has a funny way of burying uncomfortable truths under phrases like economic expansion. Meanwhile, back in Europe on March 12th, 1613, André Le Nôtre is born. If you've ever seen the gardens at Versailles, you've seen his work. Le Nôtre basically invented the concept of landscaping as propaganda. His gardens were enormous geometric masterpieces, where every tree, path, and fountain was carefully positioned to demonstrate that King Louis XIV could literally command nature itself. Because nothing says divine right of kings like trimming the bushes so perfectly that even the trees are afraid to rebel. Versailles Gardens were essentially the 17th century version of a billionaire's Instagram account. Look how symmetrical everything is. Look how controlled everything is. Look how nature itself acknowledges my authority. And if that sounds like peak human arrogance, wait until we get to astronomy. Segment 3, when humanity accidentally doubled the solar system. On the night of March 12th, going into March 13th in 1781, a musician named William Herschel was scanning the sky through a telescope he built in his backyard, which already sounds like the beginning of either a scientific breakthrough or a neighborhood HOA complaint. Instead, Herschel noticed a strange object moving slowly through the constellation Gemini. At first, he thought it was a comet, but after careful observation, he realized something astonishing. He had discovered a new planet. Uranus became the first planet discovered with a telescope and effectively doubled the known size of the solar system. Imagine being alive in 1781 and suddenly learning the universe is twice as big as you thought yesterday. Astronomy has a wonderful way of humbling humanity. Every few centuries, we discover the universe is vastly larger and more complicated than we imagined, which is ironic because humans still routinely struggle to organize traffic circles. Segment 4, disasters, disease, and the price of progress. March 12th also brings us one of the darkest events in North American colonial history. In 1862, a ship carrying smallpox arrived in Victoria, British Columbia. The disease quickly spread among indigenous communities who had gathered near the colonial city for trade. And the colonial government responded in a way that historians today describe as catastrophically negligent. Settlers were vaccinated. Indigenous camps were not. Authorities forced infected communities to leave the area rather than implementing proper quarantine measures. The result was one of the worst epidemics in the history of the Pacific Northwest. Tens of thousands of indigenous people died, wiping out entire villages and destabilizing societies that had existed for centuries. It's one of those historical moments that forces us to confront how often colonial expansion was accelerated not just by military force, but by disease and indifference. History isn't always comfortable, but it's important. Because if we ignore these moments, we risk pretending the past was cleaner and simpler than it really was. Segment 5, Revolutions, Radio, and the Birth of Modern Politics. March 12th also gave the world one of the most famous acts of civil resistance in modern history. In 1930, Mahatma Gandhi began the Salt March, walking 240 miles to the Arabian Sea to protest the British monopoly on salt. Now, salt might sound like a strange cause for revolution, but Gandhi understood something powerful. Everyone needs salt. By protesting the tax on something so basic, he turned colonial injustice into something millions of ordinary people could relate to. And when Gandhi finally reached the ocean and lifted a handful of salty mud in defiance of British law, it triggered nationwide protests across India. Nonviolent resistance suddenly became a political force capable of shaking an empire. 3 years later, on March 12, 1933, Franklin D. Roosevelt delivered his first fireside chat. The United States was deep in the Great Depression. Banks were collapsing, and Americans were terrified their savings would disappear overnight. Roosevelt sat down with a microphone and calmly explained how the banking system worked, which doesn't sound exciting until you realize it restored public confidence in the financial system almost overnight. Sometimes the most powerful political weapon isn't force. Sometimes it's simply explaining complicated things clearly. Segment 6, the Cold War, Independence, and a World in Transition. March 12, 1947 gave us the Truman Doctrine, where President Harry Truman declared that the United States would support countries resisting communist influence. This speech effectively launched the policy of containment and helped define the Cold War, which meant that from that point forward, nearly every regional conflict on Earth had a chance of becoming a global ideological showdown. Because nothing makes geopolitics calmer than two nuclear superpowers competing for influence. But March 12th also produced hopeful moments. In 1968, the island nation of Mauritius gained independence from Britain. At the time, many experts predicted the country would fail due to poverty, ethnic divisions, and lack of resources. Instead, Mauritius developed into one of Africa's most stable democracies and strongest economies. In conclusion, on this single day, we witnessed the decline of ancient Rome, the spark that ignited the Crusades, the birth of revolutionary movements, the discovery of new worlds in space, and the struggles of societies confronting injustice and disaster. Some events reshaped empires, others reshaped ideas. But together, they showed the same pattern repeating across centuries. Humanity constantly breaks things, rebuilds them, discovers something new, and then argues about it for the next 100 years.